Hey guys, so welcome to the first session of the GAP sessions, where today we're going to talk about understanding gaps and where to start. So some of you might come in and watch this live, but it doesn't matter whether you watch it live or not. As you are watching it, I'm happy for you to write down your questions in the comments and I'll still come back in and answer them. So whether or not you watch it live, you'll still be getting the same value from the session. So in today's session, we're going to go into understanding gaps and where to start. So a lot of you probably already have a good knowledge of gaps, but even when I now listen to Dr. Natasha talking about the basics of gaps, I always still gain something from it, just something that she says or a way that she puts something. So it's always really good to go back and really look over what gaps is and why we're doing it and how all the underlying processes of gaps and what we mean when we're trying to heal, and it also helps with explaining it to people as well. And a really big part of the way that I work with my clients is it's all about the education. So my goal is when I work with my clients that you won't need me anymore, that you'll get the education you need from the information that I'm sharing from Dr. Natasha, so that you can take care of your own family's health. And that's Dr. Natasha's intention with this protocol. It's taking health back into our own hands so we can be empowered and know how to be healthy. So I'll start with talking about gut healing and how the damage happens and what we're talking about, what we mean when we're talking about healing the gut. So we once thought that in the womb, babies' guts were sterile, but we now know that when they're in the womb, they're starting to swallow some amniotic fluid in there and starting to get some bacteria happening in their gut. So the big infiltration of bacteria happens when they pass through the birth canal, when and if they pass through the birth canal, so vaginal birth. They then get infiltrated with bacteria, and then when breastfeeding, and they also get the bacteria of the environment in which they're born. So what's happening there is that the gut microbiome and the vaginal microbiome of the mother and of the father, because that's being shared when two people have sex, they're sharing their bacteria, and so that's altering each person's microbiome. So this microbiome is being passed on to the child. So our gut health is only ever going to be as good as our parents' gut health. So that's the first kind of stage of the process, is getting that first infiltration of gut bacteria that's setting us up with a microbiome. So then what can interfere with that is, of course, the health of the parents. And also, if antibiotics is taken during pregnancy, during birth, which is quite common, particularly with strep B, if that's been diagnosed. So there are a few things that can interfere there, and also cesarean birth. So cesarean birth not passing through the birth canal, so not getting that initial infiltration with bacteria. So the next how things can develop from there is that when the baby's born, if they're not getting the right bacteria and a good healthy microbiome right from the start, then what's happening is the gut lining starts to become damaged, because that imbalance, that dysbiosis of gut bacteria, causes the gut lining to become unhealthy. So our gut lining and our gut microbiome, the bacteria, that army of bacteria that live in the gut lining and all over our body, they rely on a healthy gut lining to be healthy, and they need to be healthy to keep the gut lining healthy. So there's this symbiotic relationship. Just like you need healthy soil to grow good flowers, and you need to be planting flowers, not weeds, the same thing goes for the gut. You need healthy gut lining to have a healthy microbiome, and a healthy microbiome to have a healthy gut lining. So we've got the baby that's been born. I could do the example of this as being me. So my mother's gut health wasn't great when she had me. I was born by a cesarean section, which means I didn't get that good infiltration of bacteria right from the start. and I was only breastfed for a few days, a couple of weeks, and then I was formula fed. So right from the start, not really set up with the best microbiome. And then I started getting ear infections. So this is something that we really commonly see in GAPS kids. It's often a part of that story when we look back at the history that something starts happening. So something like ear infections, tonsillitis, issues with adenoids, having to get grommets. So we start to see these issues, and maybe eczema, colic, and often things where antibiotics are then taken. So the antibiotics then further damage the gut lining further damaging that gut microbiome, because antibiotics, they don't discriminate. They wipe out good with bad. And so that's further damaging the microbiome, which then is further damaging the gut lining. And so you can see how this starts to progress. So when there's a dysbiosis in the gut, the imbalance of bacteria, those bad bacteria start producing toxins, and those toxins start flooding through the body. So instead of the gut being a source of nourishment where we're absorbing the nutrients from our food, it starts to become a source of toxicity where there's dysbiosis and there's bacteria that are producing toxins which are then floating through the body. So and it can be the biggest source of toxicity that people are dealing with is what's going on in the gut. So that toxicity starts then floating around the body, that damages the gut lining. So when the gut lining becomes damaged, it then becomes leaky. So with our gut lining, we want nice, healthy cell junctions that, that way you can see it. So we want the cells to be nice and tight cell junctions in the gut lining. And when the gut's leaky, what's happening is those cell junctions are becoming loose. And so then food can start traveling through the gut lining, not properly broken down. So the proteins in the foods need to be broken down to a certain amount in a gut with nice, healthy cell junctions. It will need to be broken down small enough to pass through these cell junctions. So if we're getting a leaky gut, a damaged leaky gut, then the food doesn't need to be broken down very much to start passing through. And then the body doesn't recognize these proteins as food. It recognizes it as something that needs to be an immune response elicited to, that it's something that's not meant to be in the body. So the body then starts eliciting immune response to these proteins coming through into the blood. And then we start developing food intolerances and autoimmunity. And then what we're also seeing is that the flood of toxicity into the blood is happening a lot more because the gut is leaky. And then we've got the toxicity flowing through the body, breaking down the blood-brain barrier. And then we start to see some issues, some of the psychological issues like depression, OCD, anxiety, and then even things like ADD, ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, and even things like schizophrenia. So what I tend to see, and has been the experience for me, is that we see the physiological symptoms. So they may be all kinds of digestive discomfort, digestive diseases like ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, diverticulitis, so seeing issues like that. And even just things like bloating and distension and pain, diarrhea, constipation. And then we can see some other kind of physiological issues like arthritis and joint pain and skin issues. And then we see some of the psychological issues. So for me, it was depression and anxiety. So for some people, it's OCD. So, and what I usually see in my practice is a combination. So there'll be the physiological symptoms, and there'll be often this something psychological to go along with it. Anxiety seems to be the number one that I'm seeing at the moment. So we see a combination of both. And so what our aim is, what GAPS is all about, is about removing the toxicity. So the way that we're doing that is by first we're removing the toxins in our environment. So we're decreasing the toxic load that's coming in. So things like cleaning products that we're using, self-care products, so shampoo, conditioner, face wash, moisturizers, toothpaste, perfumes. So all the things we're putting in and around and on our bodies. So Dr. Natasha's recommendation with this is pretty much to use nothing, because anything we're using, even natural soaps on our body, disturb our microbiome. So you may not want to use nothing. So it's just about making the best choice that you can about the products that you use. When it comes to cleaning, I really don't use anything other than essential oils, vinegar and lemon and bicarb. And you can do a really good job with that stuff. So the cleaning can be really simple, and then looking at the what you're washing your clothes with, what you're washing your dishes with, and the skincare products. So when it comes to addressing those things, I consider the most important ones to look at first are the things you're putting on your skin and what you're brushing your teeth with, what you're putting in your mouth. So I will put up a info sheet which has just some recommendations for each of those things, some of the things that I use or recommend for those products. So we're removing toxins as much as we can from the environment, so what's coming in into our bodies, so reducing that toxic load as much as possible. And then by following something like the GAPS protocol, we're then reducing the toxic load that our body is producing. So GAPS is very much about this part, this toxicity. So the toxicity is what is causing the disease. You may be someone who has a bit of a GAP story like me, that, I can see I was cesarean born, bottle fed, had ear infections when I was young, had lots of antibiotics, started getting pains in the belly, was always very dark under the eyes. What else? And then, got things like acne, lots of thrush and UTIs. I used to get cysts and abscesses in my breasts at a really, really young age. Anxiety, depression, pretty much always diarrhea or constipation, and I just thought that was normal. Lots of different pains, particularly knee pain. So I can kind of go through my history with these things that I had going on, and some intolerances as well that started to get worse when I was older. But when we're kind of going through that, through our childhood and our teen years, I would never really say that I was a really sickly child, because I wasn't. Most of the time everything was fine. It was just these underlying things that we just didn't have the information to understand could develop into an issue. So what happens is that over time, as we're getting, this toxic load in our bodies, there comes a point at which our detox pathways will not cope anymore. And that's usually the point at which I see my clients, and that's usually the point at which people realize they really need to do something. So it can be an onset of like a really stressful situation that can tip our bodies over the edge. It can be like it was for me, your 20s, where we're perhaps not as kind, or some of us are not as kind to our bodies as we could be. So that definitely was a big tipping point for me. So drugs and alcohol in my 20s, which my body could not at all cope with. So there'll be some kind of event or just the build up over time, and it gets to the point where our detox pathways can no longer cope, and then they start to shut down, and then we really get that big onset of symptoms. So that's the point where I often see my clients that when they reflect, we can see what's led to it, but it's like, and then all of a sudden, or over the last couple of years, I'm feeling really fatigued. I've started getting this skin issue. I started getting these digestive symptoms. So we just start to see this onset of symptoms when we get to that point. And they can be psychological symptoms as well. So depression, anxiety, OCD. So the toxicity is what is a really big factor in causing the chronic illness. And so GAPS is really focused on, first and foremost, removing toxicity from the body and clearing the detox pathways. And so the biggest factor in doing that is reducing our biggest source of toxicity, which is an unhealthy gut. So another big factor in GAPS is that we're very nutrient deficient. So currently with industrial farming, industrial agriculture, the way things are grown, it's not to grow the healthiest plant or the most nutritious plant, vegetable, animal. So the priority in industrial agriculture is profit. So to grow things at the highest profit. So if we were to have someone produce vegetables for health, so produce vegetables that would be the healthiest and most nutritious, and then someone else produce vegetables that are the most profitable. This would be gone about in very, very different ways. So we would have a very, very different end product. And so when we're eating fruits and vegetables from industrial agriculture, then we're eating something that's being produced with profit as the end point. And so we're eating a lot of toxins, we're eating fruits and vegetables that are deficient of nutrients because they're grown in soils that are depleted. So we really want to look at where we're getting our food from, because a lot of the GAPS issues and symptoms and what's going on is nutritional deficiencies. So particularly things like fats and proteins. So we're very nutrient deficient. So we want to get our fruits and vegetables from local farms that don't spray. And when it comes to, I always have my clients asking me about organic versus spray-free. My number one pick is local, spray-free. So it doesn't need to be organic. Organic, biodynamic is ideal. So biodynamic farming takes organic to that next level where there is a focus on restoring the nutrients of the soil. So it's going the full circle of the process when you're buying biodynamic. So if you can get biodynamic, that's great. But local spray-free, something that comes from small farms where they have cows and chickens and vegetables and lots of different things going on the farms, mixed farms, rather than just someone that just grows one thing, which is the monoculture we're seeing in industrial agriculture. So something really interesting that I've heard Dr. Natasha say is that 70 to 75% of the world's population is actually fed by small holdings, small mixed farms, organic farms. So industrial agriculture really makes us think that they've got a big stronghold on the world, but they actually don't. So, and a lot of that is happening in second and third world countries, but there is a lot around for us as well. So it's very accessible. So we're wanting to, GAPS is very focused then on making sure that food is very, very nutrient dense. And so when starting out on GAPS, you'll eat a lot more proteins and fats than would generally be needed in a day-to-day life. And that's because what's happening is our body has been starved from nutrients. When we've been eating a standard Australian diet, our body's been starved of certain nutrients, a lot of nutrients, because we've been eating nutrient depleted foods. So when we're starting out with GAPS, we're needing really highly densely nutritious foods, things high in animal fats. So the most important foods on GAPS are the stocks, the fats, cod liver oil, egg yolks, fermented foods, and organ meat. So all really densely nutritious foods, and we need a lot of them, because when we start GAPS and start eating these healing foods, our body begins to do this process that we call detoxing and retracing. So pulling out toxins and also pulling out cells and proteins that are second grade, that the food that we're now putting in, this, you know, grass-fed, organic where possible, local, nutrient-dense food. And then our body is recognizing that the proteins that we're currently got going on, so our whole body is made from the foods that we eat. So the proteins that are currently in our body are just second grade compared to this really nutrient-dense food we're now putting in. So our body also goes through this process of pulling all those proteins out and replacing them. So that's why when we start with GAPS, it's quite a high protein and very high in fat initially. So and that can go on for the duration of doing GAPS. That it'll be probably the most protein and fat that you'll ever eat in your life as your body starts to pull that nutrition that it needs. So a big question I get asked is, what if I can't afford organic? What if I can't afford, you know, all the grass-fed meats? You know, what's the most important? So Dr. Natasha says that at least animals have their own detox pathways. So animals can detox some of the toxins and things that they're exposed to, whereas vegetables don't have a detox system. So when we're eating sprayed vegetables, we're getting all of those chemicals and the toxicity from that. When we're eating the meat that may be exposed, or eating grains and different things with chemicals on it, then at least that animal may have had the opportunity to detox some of that. So I generally say to people, try and go for at least spray-free with your vegetables and make that a priority. And then with your meats, of course, organic would be great, but at least grass-fed. And I would do, for example, if I could access, which I can access, grass-fed beef at the markets that's local and antibiotic and hormone free, if I can access that, and then at Woolies I can get organic beef, I would get the one from the markets. So I'd always be prioritizing what's local and raised properly, that gets to be pastured out in the sunshine, and no use of antibiotics or hormones. That will be my first pick, because the animal not being stressed, being out in the sunshine, being in a herd, that's all really important. So just because something's organic, and particularly the things we're getting at supermarkets, it doesn't mean that that's happened. So it means that they're being fed organic feed, but not necessarily getting raised on pasture and being out in the sunshine and that kind of thing. Okay, so yes, so we're getting the most nutrient-dense food in as we can, so our body can start restoring the nutrition. And then we've also talked about we're removing the toxicity by removing as many toxins as we can from our environment, and then also from our food. So we're eating food with as least toxic load as we possibly can. And then we're eating really nutrient-dense food to restore our body's nutrient status. And so the biggest factor of GAPS, and the one that we're all talking about, is the gut healing part. So by healing the gut, what we're doing is we're removing that toxic load that, 90% of the toxins in our body come from our gut. So by healing the gut, what we're doing is removing that toxic load that is causing the chronic illness, and then also allowing our bodies to properly absorb the nutrition that it needs to restore our nutrient status. So when we talk about healing the gut, I'll talk a little bit more first about what kind of damage is happening there. So in the gut, we have these finger-like projections that go like this, and they're called villi. And so they move things along through the gut and also absorb nutrition. So there's these little cells on the villi that are born down here in what we call the crypts, and they travel up in a couple of days and then they get shut off. So while they're traveling up, they're doing their job and they're getting shut off. So we've got these, they're called epithelial cells. So these cells have little hairs. So they've just got like little hairs coming out the top of their heads. I could probably do this, that would look more like what they look like. So they're like little cells with little hairs coming off the top, and those hairs have little enzymes on them that help to break down and absorb food. And so when our gut lining is unhealthy, then these cells, instead of looking nice and happy with nice hairs on the top of them, they're looking crinkled and unhappy, and their hairs are all falling off and all over the place and don't have the enzymes on them. So they're not functioning properly. So, and they may be born here and then take too long to travel up, or they might travel up too quickly. So they're just not functioning properly, those epithelial cells. So what the main purpose of the meat stocks is to start feeding and restoring these cells on the gut lining. So that's where meat stocks is really the underpinning of GAPS, and that's what we're getting everyone on, as usually the first GAPS food we start introducing is these meat stocks, and they're the basis, and that is healing and sealing and repairing the gut lining. And so are the those soft gelatinous meats and the marrows and the fats. So we're having these foods to start healing and repairing that gut lining, and also because of the nutrition, the fats, the proteins that are in those as well. And so that's kind of the first part of healing the gut. We're wanting to repair that gut lining. And the other factor that we're looking at is restoring the microbiome, so restoring that bacteria. So we're doing that by first removing toxicity, and that stops feeding some of that bacteria. And then we're introducing some good bacteria. So using our probiotic foods and a commercial probiotic, we're starting to feed that good bacteria and changing the microbiome. And so another really, really big question I get asked, and it gets talked about a lot in all of the groups, is things like parasites and metals. So parasites and metals are something we will go into more in another session. But something I just want to say about it here is that it's just kind of developing the attitude we're having when we're looking at this aspect of restoring the microbiome. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to change an ecosystem. So even when we're talking about getting the bad bacteria out, we're not going in a way of, okay, let's just kill all the bad bacteria. That's really like the Western medical model approach that we're getting away from. The approach we're taking and what we're focusing on is actually changing an ecosystem. So it would be like having weeds in your garden, and instead of just going and killing and pulling out all the weeds, introducing a plant that would take care of that weed and not let it proliferate. So that's the kind of approach we're taking with GAPS. We don't need to go in and kill and kill and kill. And I know, I'm not even talking about antibiotics there, but even doing a natural approach like all the antibacterials and antimicrobials and the herbs and things as well. We don't need to go in with that approach. What we're trying to do with GAPS is go in with an approach of restoring the good bacteria and giving the body what it needs so that the microbiome can heal and balance out and start taking care of this stuff themselves. So when we've got the beneficial bacteria, the opportunistic bacteria, which is what we refer to as bad bacteria, but more correctly, they're actually opportunistic. And we've got the transitional bacteria. So the beneficial bacteria, they're the guys we want lots of. The opportunistic bacteria, we just want that kept in check. So it's not like you need to go and wipe out all the bad guys. It's not really like they're good and bad. It's more that they're opportunistic, and when the good bacteria, the beneficial bacteria, is running the show, then that opportunistic bacteria is actually used for good. So they're actually needed. But we just can't let, and this is what's happening in GAPS people, is that the opportunistic bacteria are taking over, and they're pushing down that beneficial bacteria, and that's causing an issue, because then they can start causing problems. Given the opportunity, the opportunistic bacteria will start causing problems in the body. So what we're doing is we're trying to restore an ecosystem by removing the toxicity, giving the body what it needs to heal, restoring the healing and sealing the gut lining. And by doing that, we're creating that healthy soil. So we're healing and sealing the gut lining. The gut lining's meant to have like a thick layer of mucus on it. And what's happening with GAPS people is that mucus layer has been broken down. And it's very, very unhealthy. So by having all those meat stocks and restoring that, we're restoring that mucosal layer. And when we go into histamines in another session, I'll go further into that and why that mucosal layer is playing a really big role there. So by restoring that mucosal layer, we are creating that healthy soil that our gut lining needs, our gut bacteria need to live in. So our gut bacteria, our microbiome needs a healthy, happy home, and that's this mucosal layer. So we're restoring that mucosal layer by doing the meat stocks and the healing and sealing, and then at the same time we're getting more good bacteria in that can live in that mucosal layer and start building a really healthy microbiome and changing that damaged microbiome with the dysbiosis. And so we're also clearing the detox pathways, and that means that our detox pathways can actually start working better and functioning better and deal with some of those. We're always going to be exposed to toxins in our environment. So our body can then deal with that properly and protect us from toxicity just becoming high within our body and not coping with it. Okay, so we'll move on to what the GAPS protocol actually looks like. So the GAPS protocol is broken up into two sections. So the intro diet and then full GAPS. So full GAPS is a pretty normal kind of what I would consider just a whole food diet. So without the grains, it's just based on the meats, the fats, veggies, fruits, nuts, seeds, some legumes, good quality dairy and eggs. So that pretty much covers the full GAPS diet. And then the intro phase is the more restrictive healing phase of the GAPS protocol, so which goes from stages 1 to 6. So starting out with stage 1, where you're having just the meat stocks. And there can be a bit of confusion between meat stocks and bone broths. And what I can do is I'll post an article which explains the difference between those two and why, when we're doing GAPS and we're doing intro, we're focusing on the meat stocks as being the most healing food that we need to heal and restore that mucosal lining on our gut. And we'll talk about it a bit in the histamines as well when we talk about histamines. So stage 1 is based on meat stocks with the gelatinous meat and veggies, things like marrow, lots of fats added to the meals, and some kraut juice as well to start that probiotic. And then things like 24-hour fermented yogurt and 24-hour fermented sour cream can be added as well if the dairy is tolerated, and ghee and butter. So that's stage 1, is just based on just having those foods. The point there of why we're just having these cooked soups of really, really well cooked veggies, no starches, and those soft gelatinous meats is that it's all very easy to digest. And that means it puts our body in like a fasting mode where the food digests so quickly, the digestive system's not having to work very hard. And so it puts the body in this fasting mode. And fasting is our body's natural state for healing and repairing. So stage 1 is very healing and repairing. And by removing all the starches, we've taken away what will be feeding good and bad bacteria. But we don't want to be giving that bad bacteria food while the body's trying to bring that dysbiosis back into balance. So stage 1, we can experience lots of symptoms, so lots of detox symptoms as the body starts pulling out toxins, also pulling out, like I was saying, those proteins in the body that are second rate that it needs to get rid of. So a lot can happen in that first stage. And then in the second stage, we move on to introducing some egg yolks and then the egg whites and some fresh herbs as well. I'm not going to go into every single food as I go through this, but just giving an outline. Stage 3, we start the avocado, scrambled eggs. We can start eating the kraut. Stage 4, we can start roasting meats and vegetables and starting GAPS shakes and GAPS breads. And stage 5, some soft raw vegetables. We can do things like stewed apple and mango and starting to gently fry some things. And stage 6, more of the raw vegetables and more raw fruits and some sweet baking. So it just kind of progresses through the 6 stages until we're on full GAPS. So how everyone approaches GAPS is very different and very individual. So I have some clients that I'll only ever work on getting them to full GAPS. So they may be on a somewhat standard Australian diet, and our focus will be moving them onto full GAPS with a really big focus on the healing foods, and they may see everything they need to see just doing that. And this is something that I talk about really often with my clients because there seems to be quite stigma, probably not stigma, but a belief around GAPS that intro is where all the healing happens. And I really like to educate people on the fact that not everybody does need to do intro, and that GAPS is a very, very healing diet and one that can be followed very long term. It's quite varied once you've been doing it for a while and start to discover all the foods and all the different things you can make. I know I definitely don't feel like I'm missing out on anything when following full GAPS. And it's very, very healing because it's all about the way you approach it and what foods you're focusing on when you do it. So like I said before, the stocks, the fats, the egg yolks, the fermented foods, the organ meats, the cod liver oil. So it's all about the way you're approaching it and what you're focusing on. And when I'm working with clients and getting them to full GAPS, they may have thyroid issues, or they may have other things going on that we're focusing on and working on. So when it comes to intro, it's very individual as to who needs to do it and how they need to do it. One thing I know for sure is that I see the best outcomes with my clients doing intro when they've been doing at least a whole food paleo style diet for a good period of time, 6 months to a year, and or full GAPS for 6 months to a year before doing intro. So for some people, that's not really an option. The issues they may be dealing with may be quite severe, and they're really needing to get into it as soon as possible. So we do move into it sooner. And I guess now most people who start looking at doing GAPS, they're generally not people that do have a standard Australian diet, because like me, I think like most of us, as you start to go down this road and on this health journey, it usually starts with eating more whole foods, cutting out sugars, and then maybe cutting out the grains. And there's a bit of a process of where you start, and then you might hear about GAPS and go, no way I'm ever doing that, like I did. I heard about GAPS and went, next thing. There's no way I'm ever doing that. Which obviously I did. So it can be a bit of a process before you land on gaps and go, okay, yep, I really need to do this. So often you have been doing whole food diet that's been removing a lot of toxicity for quite a while, and so then people are ready to do intro if they do need to. So intro is really for people when they're needing to resolve digestive issues and intolerances. It can be really beneficial for severe psychological issues. So particularly kids with ADD, ADHD, autism, they do really well on intro, and they usually have the digestive symptoms to go along with it. So the intro diet really is to resolve those digestive symptoms and the food intolerances so that you can introduce all of the healing foods that need to be had when you move on to full GAPS. So some of the questions I get asked around intro are things like, oh, if I've done intro and I haven't seen all the healing, do I have to go back and start again? And my answer to that is no. So if you've gone through intro and you've been introducing all the foods and everything is well tolerated, but you still haven't seen a complete resolution in the issues, then staying on full GAPS with a focus on the healing foods is really the approach that you need to take. So as I said, full GAPS is a very, very healing diet. And that's why, we move through the intro stages and then we move on to full GAPS and stay on it for at least 2 years. So when it comes to doing intro, I'll also just mention the people that shouldn't do intro. So if there's chronic constipation, then it's not recommended, definitely not recommended to start with intro. We start with full GAPS and we work on resolving the constipation first, and then we can move on to intro. For mothers who are pregnant or breastfeeding, it's not really recommended to go straight into intro. And if you're doing GAPS and you're pregnant or breastfeeding, highly recommend working with a practitioner on that, because there is ways to do it, but it just needs to be done very carefully and properly to do that. And if it's done that way, it can be very, very beneficial for the baby. So they're the kinds of people that shouldn't really do intro. And also I'll go into that in a little bit. So when it comes to doing intro, another big question is, how long should I stay on each stage? And that is like a how long is a piece of string kind of question, because that's really different for everybody, how long they will stay on a stage. So some of my clients can manage just doing a week per stage, and that's generally the minimum I like to give people. We say at least 7 days on each stage. And then I have some other clients that have had really severe digestive issues that have been on the early stages of GAPS for years. So that's not your general case. And I know for those people that they're far better off than they were not on GAPS and already very restricted and reacting to foods. So even for those people that do need to stay on it for much longer periods, they're in a better place than when they weren't on it. So, and just with GAPS as a protocol altogether, when I get asked, I often get comments from people like, oh, how do you do such a restrictive diet? I could never do that. And to me, I just think my diet's not restrictive. And what's more restrictive, eating these beautiful fresh foods or having health issues? To me, getting up and having lots of energy in the morning and feeling good and not having brain fog, feeling a lot happier and coping with emotions much, much better than I used to, not being bloated and having diarrhea or constipation and these issues that when you've had little niggling issues for a long time, that feeling of that loss of control, you just don't even know what's good and what's not and what you should be doing with your body to me, that is restrictive. Like that is when I felt restricted. And I didn't enjoy food then because I didn't know what was good and what would make me feel good and what would make me feel horrible and what was healthy and what was not. And, you know, we get so many contradicting ideas on that. So to me, that was much more restricting and much more stressful, is being in that position than knowing what's good for my body and feeling happy and healthy. And like I can feed my son and nourish his body in a way where I know we're doing the right thing and he's happy and healthy. So yeah, wherever you need to be on GAPS and however you're approaching it, it's always kind of having that attitude towards it, that remembering what it feels like to be unhealthy, and that it may seem challenging to start approaching something like GAPS, but it's not as challenging as dealing with the health issues and just not knowing what to do or where you're at. So yeah, so when it comes to intro, the length of time spent on each stage and on intro all up can vary greatly from person to person with how that looks. And as I mentioned, whether or not you need to do intro at all also varies greatly from person to person. And if there's digestive symptoms, then that is definitely a situation where we would suggest doing intro. So a really big factor in deciding to do GAPS, and I see it as you know, having the right attitude towards it, so that the approach to GAPS for you and your family can be healthy over the long term. So I think it really needs to be approached with the right attitude, and that is seeing it as a protocol, that it is just a protocol, that it doesn't need to be lifelong. For some people it does, and that's in very severe cases, and they'll be feeling so much better that they're very happy for it to be lifelong. But it really is a protocol. It's not about foods being good or bad. And that's a really big one, and that's a lesson I had to learn myself, with having a big fear of sweet potato after doing GAPS and never wanting to eat sweet potato again. But I do now eat sweet potato because I'm not doing GAPS anymore. Although, you know, I still stick to a Western A price kind of diet, and grains are still out for us because they're still not tolerated well. So it's not about food being good or bad. It's about doing a protocol for a reason to heal. So some food is more difficult to digest and can feed the good and bad bacteria. So when there's dysbiosis and gut damage, we're wanting to give the gut a rest, and we're wanting to not be feeding starches and sugars to the bad bacteria that we're trying to overcome. So I think the wording you use around GAPS with your family and with yourself really needs to be focusing on that it's not about food being good or bad. It's not about focusing on the restriction and what we're missing out on. I really like to flip that and focus on how we can get more nourishment in. So how we can give our body a break from foods that are more difficult to digest and will feed some of those bad bacteria, and how we can focus on getting more nourishment in. And I think that to me is just a beautiful part of GAPS, that we're always talking about the nutrient density of this beautiful, nutritious food, and you know, feeling about that way about the food as you're making it and feeding your family, and focusing on how nutrient dense what we're getting is. And our bodies are very smart. Our bodies are always just seeking the nutrition that it needs. So if we're craving sugars, if we're overeating, binge eating, any issues like that, with those kind of cravings, our body is very, very smart, and it's just always about craving nutrition. Our body is trying to seek the nutrition that it needs. So kind of switching the way we've always been taught to look at dieting and health is that it's about willpower, and we just have no willpower, and we're just, you know, we're to blame, and it's because we're lazy and we don't exercise. You know, it always comes back to us, while the food companies are just pumping us full of carbs and refined sugars and starches. So to really kind of, if we flip our attitude to that and see it as our bodies are very smart, our bodies are seeking nutrition. Okay, I'm craving stuff. What is my body actually seeking here? And then looking at the foods we're eating is really getting this nutrition in, restoring our body's nutrition, and feeding and nourishing with what we need so our body can heal. And then, looking at the terminology we're using around GAPS. So not talking about bad foods or that it's bad for us, but that we're taking a break from foods that just take more work for the digestive system and that can feed the bad bacteria whilst there's too much of the bad bacteria. And so we're just having a break from those foods so we can heal the body, and then we can get back to eating some of those foods, the real foods, which can be grains. You can eat, it's not that you can't ever eat grains again. If they're well tolerated, which I said that we don't eat grains because they're not. One we can eat very occasionally is rice. So we've started eating a little bit of rice every now and then. So yeah, it's not that you can never eat these foods again. It's about just healing the body so that it's functioning well. And when it comes to approaching GAPS, it's really important to just start from where you are at. So it can all look very overwhelming when you read the GAPS book and you're a part of some of the GAPS groups and you're kind of seeing what everyone's doing, and it all seems a bit full on and overwhelming and lots of terminology that you might not understand, and talking about histamines and metals and different things about GAPS and intro. So it can all seem quite overwhelming. And so what I really like to get across to people there is GAPS just starts from where you're at. So, and it's all about just taking steps from there, because when you start this journey with GAPS, it's going to be for the long term. So not that you need to stay on GAPS, full GAPS long term, but everything that you learn and the changes you make, a lot of it will be lifelong, like the way that you're cooking, the kind of foods that you eat, making the meat stocks. So a lot of the philosophy of what you're learning in GAPS is going to be lifelong. So it's really important to be kind to yourself in the way that you approach it. And that's just taking a step at a time. So when we start something like a diet, we're always, have that diet starts Monday kind of mentality where it's all in or nothing. You're on the wagon or you're off the wagon. And it really doesn't need to work like that. So for me, when I first did GAPS intro, I didn't get it right the first time. So I would start and have really severe detox symptoms, end up craving something, eating something that I shouldn't. I don't think it was off full GAPS, but even if it was, that doesn't matter. So it's not like it just all needs to look perfect in one go. And anything you are adding in is starting the healing process. So when I start working with my clients and they're moving from more a whole food diet and we're shifting over to full GAPS, my first focus will just be on the things we're adding in. It won't even be on the things we're cutting out, because we need to start getting the nutrition in. So focusing on how we can get the dense nutrition in. And then when it comes to the things that we start removing, you don't even miss them, because your body's always seeking nutrition. And so when you start getting that nutrition in, it becomes very easy to start shifting over. And when you've got kids and you're starting to change a diet, the food that they're eating, then jumping all in right at the start is not very easy. It can become very stressful and overwhelming. It can become really stressful for them too. And so it's just not, you just don't need to approach it in that way. So it's all about just looking at where you're at and taking steps that may seem a little challenging but achievable, not overwhelming. So it's just always starting where you're at. And as we make changes over a period of time, just little changes, that becomes big changes. And that's how I did it. My journey from a SAD diet to where I'm at now started with just making treats, dessert kind of things that were refined sugar free. At the start, they were made with rice puffs and rice malt syrup and things that I don't eat now, but that's okay because that was my first step and starting to experiment and getting rid of the refined sugars. And then it was, it just kind of went on from there over years of starting to change things. So doesn't need to be all in or nothing. And it's just all about doing what feels manageable in your life with your family from where you are at right now. And in saying that, when we talk about gaps, we are talking a lot about the food side of things, but really important aspect of gaps is looking after the foundations of health. So to me, the foundations of health are reducing stress, making sure we're getting out in the sunshine, having healthy relationships, having a good family life and social life, having some kind of, it's not for everyone, but I see it as important, as having some kind of spirituality, whether that's a religion or spirituality in any kind of sense, but feeling it could just be a connection with nature, just feeling some kind of connection. And, healthy work environment, self-care, so making sure we're looking after ourselves, getting plenty of sleep, having fun, so having joy in your life with your family. So these things are all really, really important for health. And we know that our attitude towards our health, so this has been studied, there's really good research that's been done on this, that a person's attitude towards their health has a direct impact on their health outcomes. So if you feel more positive about your health and well-being, you're going to have better outcomes. I've talked a little bit about in some of my Facebook Lives on my business page, I've talked a bit about things like cold water thermogenesis and different breathing exercises. And something I found particularly interesting was a study that was done. You may have heard of Wim Hof. They call him the Iceman. He can go and climb Everest in a pair of shorts. So he's trained his body to kind of control those parameters in really stressful situations. So he can control his body temperature and immune response. And he wanted to show that anyone can do this. And so he trained up some guys and he took them and they climbed mountain in minus 27 degrees in pair of shorts, and they were able to maintain their body temperature. And then he also did a study where they were injected with E. coli, and they had a control group who were also injected with E. coli, and they got all the symptoms. But doing the breathing exercise for these guys in the intervention group, where they did the breathing exercises before being injected with E. coli, their body started eliciting an immune response. So this, to me, the reason I'm mentioning this and why I find that so interesting is that a lot of what we're trying to deal with in GAPS is this balance of bacteria and the way our body defense systems are working. So when we can see that food is not the only way that we can impact how our body's defense systems are working, it's also, just learning things like different breathing exercises, reducing stress in our body, because if we're in chronic stress, then our body's in chronic inflammation, a chronic fight and flight response, which is depleting nutrition and damaging our adrenals and our thyroid. So these foundations of health are really important to focus on. And if you are doing GAPS and you find that you're run ragged trying to do all the cooking and do all the things and really stressed, and then it's getting stressful at home and snapping at the kids because you've pushed yourself way too much trying to achieve something that's just not even achievable right now, then that's to the detriment of everyone's health, most of all your own. So I just really like to put a spotlight on that I see it as most important to make sure the foundations are there for health, that you're reducing stress, reducing everybody's busyness in the family. If the kids have lots of after school activities and you have lots of extracurricular activities as well, and everyone's just too busy, then you kind of setting it up that if you were then trying to implement gaps, it would be a very stressful experience. So I see implementing there's so much you can start implementing to reduce stress in the life, bring more joy and happiness into the family. Not saying that you don't already have that, but making sure that those things aren't getting sacrificed by really trying to implement gaps perfectly when the space hasn't been made in your life yet for it. Okay, so that wraps us up for GAPS session number 1, and most of you will be watching this as a replay. So as I said, I'm really happy for you to write your comments as you're watching it, when you've got questions, and I'll come back in and I'll answer those questions. And I look forward to seeing you guys next week for number 2. All right, thanks, bye.